Victor Perton here. In today's Optimism Cafe at the Centre for Optimism, I'm delighted we can welcome Larry Reid, the President Emeritus of the Foundation for Economic Education, the Humphreys Family Senior Fellow, and the Ron Manners Global Ambassador for Liberty. Not only that, but he's an optimist. He recently shared an essay, What Anne Frank and Dr. Christian Larson Can Teach Us About the Power of Optimism. What I found intriguing is reading his essay in Liberty as a Life Philosophy, where he wrote, even if it's hard to be optimistic for society as a whole, you can still be optimistic for yourself and those you love and affect. And he advised, have a healthy sense of humor, a good feel for both your strengths and weaknesses, a bubbly optimism, and exuberance about making a difference in the world. It's a delight to welcome Larry Reid to the Optimism Cafe. Larry, look, welcome. And look, the thing that goes through my head when I look at you on screen is your advice to all of us to share a bubbly optimism.
Yes.
So the first question we always ask at the Centre for Optimism is what makes you optimistic? So what makes you optimistic, Larry?
Well, several things, Victor and Jeff. One, of course, is my faith, because it teaches me that in the end, whenever that may be, things like justice and goodness and accountability will emerge victorious. So I have confidence that that will arrive at some point in the future. Whether I'm alive to see it or whether it comes later is another matter, of course. Another reason I am optimistic is my knowledge of history tells me that people, in order to move forward, to progress, to be better than, or leave the world a better place than they found it, they have to be optimistic, because pessimism is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're pessimistic, if you've in effect admitted that you're going to lose whatever your cause may be before you really finish the fight. What's the point of that? It simply assures that you will lose the effort that you're immersed in. So I don't engage in self-fulfilling prophecies. I don't think there's any point to it. And a couple of bad things happen when you become pessimistic. One is that you stop being an effective spokesperson for whatever cause you may be promoting, because nobody wants to join a losing effort. If you tell everybody, hey, join in, but we're going to lose this, well, what's the point of that? So pessimism is self-fulfilling in so many destructive ways. You won't work as hard yourself for what you believe in if you're pessimistic about its success, and you won't be very effective at convincing others to join your cause as well.
So what we've been doing recently, as well as asking people what makes them optimistic, that foundational question, is a different question, which is what makes you feel optimistic? What are those things you see and do, those things that bring you joy in the day, that restore and fulfill your optimism?
Well, it's opposite. Pessimism is sort of another way of saying that other people are in charge of my life. And in my case, I don't believe that for a second. I believe I'm in charge of it. And of course, like anyone, I'm buffeted by the decisions and circumstances and events of the day that other people have influence over. But in the end of it all, I'm still in charge. So I can choose to do those things that keep me optimistic and make me happy. I'm not anyone's slave. And so it makes me optimistic just knowing that whatever happens tomorrow, I'm largely in control of it. And I can eschew those bad things that might hold me back or drag me down.
It's remarkable. Today on our blog, I quoted Shania Twain, the singer. She's written a new album called Queen of Me, and she says, finding optimism and really holding myself responsible for my frame of mind, I started writing lyrics that made me smile and laugh, and melodies and rhythms that made me want to dance. and it worked. So I think you and Shania Twain are on song together today.
Yeah, but I can see why she makes a lot more money. She said it so much better.
So look, reading your life history, you've been honored by the Polish government. You were inspired by the Prague Spring. I'm the son of refugees from the Baltic states. So, for me, it was the inspiration of their struggles really from the middle of the 19th century through to later. So we share a similar inspiration, and you're passionate, I'd almost call you a warrior for liberty.
Yes.
So what makes you optimistic for liberty?
Well, I think back to the days when I was meeting with people who were active in anti-communist underground movements in places like Poland in the 1986 and in the year 1986 when I went to Poland, and for decades before, they were fighting the good fight without any inkling that success was just around the corner. If you had said to anybody you might have met in the Eastern European satellite countries of the old Soviet Union as late as 1988, that within a year they would be liberated and free, they would have said, what? Well, there must be some events in the works that I can't foresee. Very few people saw it coming. And yet, when I think back to the many meetings I had with such people, they were so optimistic. They didn't know when freedom might come, but they knew that it was worth fighting for, that it was a noble cause, that at the very least, they would instill in later generations the desire to see it happen, and that would someday make it happen. And so I think back to those days, those travels, those meetings, and I ask myself, well, how can I be pessimistic when those people faced such oppression, didn't see the light of the end of the tunnel until the very last moment practically, and yet they maintained their optimism. And in fact, that was one of the reasons that freedom ultimately prevailed, because those people were optimistic, never gave up. And when the communists told them that they were going to live under communism forever, they didn't believe it.
My grandmother got me to take her to the first rally of Sąjūdis, which was the Lithuanian version of Solidarność. And my grandfather was tortured to death in 1940. She was sent to the Gulag and could never talk about what happened there. But 1987, she took part in, the Million Hands Across the Baltics. And she said to me, I'm going to outlive communism. And of course, when Yeltsin stood on the tank, and I rang her and I said, amazing things are happening in Moscow. She said, I know, I'm watching on CNN. And, there she was. She outlived the communists who had enslaved her. So for me, she is a great example of an optimistic leader. And I'd like to throw to Jeff to talk to you about the leaders you've admired and what's inspired you. Can I throw to you, Jeff?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd read a little bit earlier, Lawrence, from a couple of your exchanges with Victor, and I really liked the idea that optimism begets optimism, and that nature, as you say, but also pessimism begets pessimism. And so I really liked the idea that you talked about having to lead with optimism, and that inspires others to follow. So one of the questions that inspired to ask was, who are the leaders that have inspired you? And particularly, I suspect very strongly that they will be optimistic leaders, but who are the leaders that inspired you and why?
Well, one certainly is a man well known for his sunny optimism, and that was President Ronald Reagan. I met him on several occasions, had lunch with him once at the White House, in fact. And that sunny optimism came through on every occasion, wherever he was, it seemed. He had a smile that was infectious. He felt that and expressed the view that the world could be a better place. You just have to work to make it so. Don't give up. Stick to your guns. And when you decide what your principles are and if they are in the right, people of character should not give up on those. They should continue to work on them, and ultimately those ideals can prevail if they do. So he was certainly one. One that I never met, but I have to say is probably the bravest most courageous person, man or woman, that I have ever come across in my historical research is a Polish man by the name of Witold Pilecki. I included a chapter about him in my book called Real Heroes. He was very active as a soldier on behalf of the Polish underground after the Nazis invaded Poland in September of 1939 from the West, and he continued to fight when the Soviets invaded 2 weeks later. And he did that for a year or two, as I recall, when the Polish underground began to realize there's something going on at this massive complex that the Germans have built near Krakow. And we have reason to believe they thought that some of our people are being taken there. We need to get somebody on the inside. Well, that place turned out to be Auschwitz, perhaps the most notorious of many Nazi concentration camps. Witold Pilecki volunteered, the only person we know who ever volunteered to get arrested by the Germans in the hope that they wouldn't just shoot him and that maybe they'd send him to Auschwitz, so that he could perhaps from the inside create some kind of resistance or smuggle out information, documentation, whatever, to tell the world about what was going on there. Well, he got his wish. He got arrested and sent to Auschwitz. And there he did create a very effective underground that smuggled out documents. They even for a time created a crude radio transmitter and were broadcasting. I mean, these are some of the inmates led by Pilecki broadcasting from inside Auschwitz. And he engineered what only about 140 other people have ever been able to successfully do, and that is an escape from Auschwitz after being there for a couple of years. And then he went off to Warsaw in time to participate in the Battle of Warsaw, fought hard there. And after the war, he was captured, by the way, a second time by the Germans. And he was found in a concentration camp, or a prisoner of war camp, I should say, when the Soviets invaded from the east. And for a brief moment in the summer of 45, with the war over, he was a free man. But the Polish underground army had sent him to Italy. And by September of 45, they realized that the Soviets didn't look like they were going to leave Poland, and they needed somebody on the inside to go spy on them. Well, who better than Witold Pilecki? So they sent him back into Poland, and for almost 3 years, he spied on the Soviets and got information out until ultimately his cover was blown. He was put on a show trial, and the Soviets ultimately executed him. But wow, what an example of moral and physical courage. The information that he smuggled out of Auschwitz, once assembled, became known as Witold's Report, the first eyewitness accounts of what was going on inside the most notorious of Nazi concentration camps. So how could you not be inspired by that man's courage?
That's incredible, incredible optimism to drive really the choices that he made. That you look at them today, and you with the benefit of all of our knowledge of the history, and think he had to have incredible optimism to want to make those choices, believing that something good would happen at the end. So that's amazing. Exactly.
And he had a wife and a daughter and a son as well. So when he went off to spy, and for the time he was in Auschwitz, he didn't see them. And I'm very happy to say that about 6 years ago, I had the great pleasure of meeting with his son in Warsaw, who still remembered very well his father, and also going to the trial of his father in 1948, only to see his father sentenced to death.
And did he have his father's optimism? Did you sense that the family had inherited it, or gone the other way?
Yes. And he was bubbly about it too, in the sense that he knew that Poland had become a better place after so many decades of oppression. He knew that it could continue to improve. He knew that free people are destined to do wonderful things. And he was very eager to share with me his story of his father, and because he just thought that, hey, if more people in the world know that story, they too will muster the courage and the optimism to fight for what they know to be right.
Very much a validation point and a proof point of his father's optimism really is the current state of Poland, or certainly at the time. And one of the other things that I'm really fascinated to hear more, you tell a story of an event in your life that confirmed your optimism.
Yes.
And it's interesting. I think a few of us have moments in time and moments in our lives which, we do tend to be challenged, or the optimism is challenged, and we have other moments where it's confirmed. What was that event that really confirmed your optimism, and when did it occur?
It happened in February of 1980. So I was born in 53. So what I would have been in late 20s. And I was living in Michigan at the time. But in the way of background, I remember growing up in Pennsylvania. So many relatives, even my parents, would say things like, "You always see the glass half full. You are so optimistic. Whenever there's something bad that happens, you're the first to see the good in it, or how it can be turned to advantage." So I always had a streak of optimism in me. I'm not sure where it came from, but relatives noted it and told me about it. Well, in February of 1980, I was driving on a very icy morning to work at Northwood University, where I was teaching. And a man was coming from the other direction toward me in his car. And he had his left turn signal on, so I knew that he wanted to turn in a side street, but I just assumed he'd wait until I passed through. But at the last minute, he decided he had time to make that turn, and he turned right in front of me. I swerved to miss his car, and there was a ravine, not a huge, 1,000-foot chasm, but a ravine on the left side of the road. And I lost control of my car, and the car headed down into the ravine, and it rolled 2 or 3 times before it ended up upside down at the bottom of the ravine. And I crawled out of the driver's side window, which had broken out, and crawled up to the top to see if the other guy was okay. But I remember exactly how I felt as I was losing control of the car and heading into that ravine. I was serenely calm. The reason I know this is I wondered about it for years afterwards, like, gee, that wasn't normal. I should have been terrified. But I was completely calm and serene about it. And what popped into my head at that moment was the thought, I'm going to get a new car out of this. And I did. So yeah, my car was totaled, so I got a brand new car out of it. So that confirmed in my mind that I have something in me. I don't know, as I say, where it came from. Maybe my parents instilled it in me, but I've always felt that I was an optimist at heart, maybe a pathological one. But I think it has served me very well over the years.
That's a
Coming
fantastic
from
story.
Pennsylvania, you've got your Martin Seligman, of course, his school of positive psychology, fostering optimism, is headquartered there. So I think there's a real connection.
There could well be. I lived in near Pittsburgh on the western side of the state, and I'm not sure where Norman Vincent Peale was from. I want to say New York, but he was another pathological optimist. And I remember reading some of his stuff and Dale Carnegie stuff as a teenager, and maybe some of their optimism rubbed off on me too.
Norman Vincent Peale's book, The Power of Positive Thinking, if you read it today, it is so modern. He advocates meditation, self-reflection. Fantastic inspiration.
He was in some ways ahead of his time. Those things didn't really come to the fore until some years after he started writing about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And because of course nowadays he's often attacked because the Trump family were parishioners at the Marble Church. But I often joke, because one of his sermons that I read, he said, don't argue with anyone unless they're wrong and they're negative. And I reckon Donald might have been asleep or, doing the equivalent of watching his TikTok rather than listening to the sermon.
Yeah, he can certainly be negative rather quickly and very deeply. But, I don't know that kind of attitude is productive. I think if you live a life of anger and nastiness, and if it's hard for you to smile, and if you're not optimistic, I think you're probably in for a shorter life than necessary. I think optimism is one of those things that adds maybe years to your life because it creates the mental well-being that has a beneficial physical effect as well.
Well, the science is there now. Both Harvard, the American military, Boston University, American Heart Association all say that optimism is the key protective trait against the three major mortalities: cancer, heart disease, and dementia. And most importantly for the doctors, it's the key predictor of recovery. So I reckon you're in for a 120-year life, as my friend John Hagel would advocate.
Oh my gosh. I
Can
guess I
throw
should have
back to
said
Jeff
more.
on change, because I'd love him to share some of his research on optimism underpinning change and transformation. And with your desire for economic freedom, you've certainly been an advocate. But I want to throw something at you. I don't know if you've ever heard the music of Michael Franti, but it's an R&B positive, and he's currently touring Australia. And he said this: I believe the great battle that's taking place in the world isn't between left and right, it's between cynicism and optimism. There are people who believe it's possible to create a better life and a better world. When we lose that sense of optimism is when we quit, when we give up. And more recently, in the British Conservative Party battle for who would be Prime Minister, Penny Mordaunt, who lost but is now leader in the House of Commons, said the fault line in politics at the moment is not between left and right, but between optimists and pessimists. We need optimists for the next tough shift. And then the last person I'd quote is Tharman, Singapore's senior minister, who I spent some time with in the G20. And he made a speech last year where he said, one of the greatest public policy issues in the world is the collapse of optimism in the developed world. And he set out the challenge to all of us to create the cases for optimism, that belief. So, one of the reasons we set up the Centre for Optimism is our perception that there is a zeitgeist of pessimism in the popular media. In fiction, you have dystopia rather than utopia. So what's your view, coming from a position where, obviously Ronald Reagan and the Polish freedom fighters are your models, but this argument that it's not between left and right anymore, it's between those who believe in a better world and those who are cynical and pessimistic?
Oh, I think there's a lot of truth to that, Victor. When I survey, as I have to do as a matter of course because of my job, the economic thinking and the moral thinking of our time, most of my work is in some way involves economics and the teaching of it. And as a believer in freedom and free markets and combining that with economics, I can't help but notice that those who argue for just the opposite, for government control, for centralization, for the concentration of power, their message is essentially a very pessimistic one. Their message essentially says to people, you can't handle life on your own. You need to be told what to do, and I'm one of the smart people who can do that and do it well, even if my personal life is already a mess. That doesn't seem to stop them most of the time. It's a very pessimistic message that government must run your life for you because you're not smart enough to do so. I look back at the great heroes in the world, but in my country in particular, since I know it best. I think of so many people who came from nothing and made something of themselves. They couldn't have done that if they'd been pessimistic. If they'd been told from the start, you can't go anywhere without our help. Or as Obama said to American entrepreneurs, you didn't build that. That kind of pessimistic thinking that implies somebody else has to tell you what to do because you're too dumb to do it is fundamentally at odds with what makes humans progress. And so I find myself in making a case for freedom and free markets that I'm constantly trying to unwind the pessimism that I find in so many people who think that, they're just worthless until a government program comes along and makes something of them.
Yeah. We ask the question, what makes you optimistic, as you know, and it just lifts people. Yesterday, I spoke at an audience of 100 people and I had enough time to get 60 of them to share what makes them optimistic. And Megumi Miki, the Japanese author, said, just being asked the question lifts me. So our research focuses on what makes you optimistic, and it brings great joy to us. Now, Jeff, do you want to share a little bit of your research on change and transformation, you know, the way that leadership underpins that?
Yeah, certainly. And Larry, a lot of we've done some research around transformation and change, and particularly the role of optimistic leadership, or the role that optimistic leadership might have in contributing to greater success in transformation and change. And as Victor mentioned up front, various consulting firms and so on have looked at transformation projects and found that 60 to 70%, depending on the research, of transformation projects fail. And one of our sort of hypotheses going into that is that that what is the role of optimistic leadership or leadership, and can optimistic leadership make a difference? And we continue to explore that that topic and that theme. But certainly we've done some surveys around what people want from their transformation and change, or what people feel is the main element that might drive success in their future business environment, including around those projects. And the interesting thing is, and this was sort of the back end of COVID that we undertook this research. So obviously the research needs to be looked through that lens. But certainly the feeling that, or the research shows that people wanted a blend of the human, the leadership aspects, not just the measured and the more sort of business execution measures of success built in to projects and transformation and the change. So, and business. And how have you found with your work on economic success at the sort of broader level, but also at a smaller corporate level? I don't know if you've worked at that level with your economic models and leadership, but how have you found the role of leadership play into the success of any of those economic initiatives, or the initiatives that you've looked at?
I think leadership is critical, and that's not because people are born followers, but rather they want motivation from someone who can give them the right direction and also empower them to help make it happen. One of the areas that I've spent considerable time in study over the years is in the cause of abolitionism, the end of slavery within the British Empire. And two of the major figures of that great movement were powerful optimists, and they cited their optimism as one of the things that kept them going. And I'm talking about William Wilberforce, the member of the British Parliament, who introduced a bill every year for 20 years until it finally passed to abolish the slave trade. And his right-hand man was Thomas Clarkson, who gathered the evidence, who traveled by horseback some 35,000 miles in those 20 years all over Britain, Scotland, and Wales, gathering testimony and documentation. All along the way, they had a lot of powerful forces working against them. In fact, when they started out, they had everything against them. In 1787, the first year, they had Parliament against them. They had public opinion. They had history, because slavery had been around forever. Public opinion was of the view that slavery is sort of natural. It's always been here. Some must live at the lash of another. And anybody who suggested in 1787 that Britain should abolish it were laughed off the stage. And all along the way, when they had a setback, they could have thrown in the towel. In the 1790s, after scoring some growth in numbers of parliamentarians willing to support their cause, Britain went to war with France, and all of a sudden the opposition declared, well, you abolitionists, you would just hand the slave trade over to the French. You're traitors. And that was a low point for them, but they never lost their optimism. And that's what kept the movement together and kept people focused on the prize. And ultimately, maybe more than anything else, that's why they won in 1807 by abolishing the slave trade. And they didn't give up. They had to get slavery done away with as well. That took another 26 years, but that finally came in 1833. If they hadn't been optimistic in the face of repeated failures and very powerful opposition, maybe that wouldn't have happened. But they changed the world, and they never for a moment thought that they couldn't do it.
And that's a fantastic. I've heard of William Wilberforce, and like many success stories, modern and some older, we hear about the success, but you don't hear about the optimism and the challenges that were overcome prior to that. So knowing that he took a bill to Parliament for 20 years, hopefully that gives some of our Australian politicians a bit of optimism for what they do, rather than giving up the first time they take a bill to be voted on. So that's a fantastic
Absolutely.
story.
Well, it took 20 years just to get the slave trade abolished, another 26 to get slavery abolished. So for people like Wilberforce in Clarkson, that was a 46-year battle. They never gave up.
And succeeded in the end. So that's fantastic. Another question that comes up and that we've asked is, what makes you optimistic about the future of work? And it's rather timely now with what we hear about as AI. Again, AI is one of those wonderful overnight successes that's been worked on by humanity for 20 or 30 years. But we're seeing sort of it obviously really transform now. So and some people have fear about it, and some people are optimistic. And certainly I side with the optimists on being able to harness it, but it does have real risks. In terms of, I guess, the future of work and where you see that playing out, how do you apply your optimism to really the environments that we're in, the environment that you're in, and the future of work from your eyes?
Well, I'm in the persuasion business, you might say, in the sense that I am trying to sell ideas of strong personal character, of individual liberty, responsibility, and free enterprise. And so I have to think all the time about, how do I convince others that these are virtues worthy of their support? Well, I long ago decided that a pessimistic outlook is not going to serve that end. I mean, what's the point of, nobody knows the future. So if you are pessimistic about it before it's ever happened, you've given up. As I say, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what makes me optimistic is the fact that people have overcome enormous odds in the past. And sometimes they did it almost at the twinkling of an eye, or at least big changes didn't seem evident until they just about happened. And you look back and try to explain why all that occurred. And I don't know of a single instance where I could say, well, it happened because everybody was pessimistic and expected to fail. No, it happened because optimism was a core component of their way of thinking. So don't give up on the future before it's even happened, or you'll wish you never did, because you'll help bad things occur.
I think it's the one thing, as you say, that because it hasn't happened, it gives us the opportunity to create it rather than let it happen to us. So that's a great insight, Lawrence. I'll throw back to you, Victor.
Listen, I haven't thought about this at great length. This morning, I read a sermon of the Archbishop of Canterbury, delivered this week, and he was talking about the loss of optimism through despair. So his story was about the apostles in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that they were thrown into despair, which destroyed the optimism which they had. And if you think about the resurrection and Jesus reappearing, you do get that reflection. So I wouldn't argue against the Archbishop of Canterbury on despair and optimism, but I contrast that with Viktor Frankl. And you've talked about the Holocaust today, but Viktor Frankl, the German psychotherapist who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, coined the phrase tragic optimism. And if I can summarize it without a script in front of me, he talked about doing your best in whatever circumstances you find yourself, whether you're in a concentration camp or living in paradise as we do here in Australia. Do your best. You want to reflect a little bit, thinking about, Wilberforce, these Polish heroes that you met and studied, Ronald Reagan, and his ability to inspire. That where do we reach that difference between, the tragic optimism, the resilience of, say, a Frankl, and this sort of Catholic Anglican view, on optimism and hope and, despair potentially destroying it. Can I throw one more in the mix, actually, from the left of politics? Jacinda Ardern at the summit on climate change a couple of years ago basically said, look, you can throw yourself into paralysis by just counting, the melting icebergs. But on the other hand, we've got the technology, we've got the will, we've got the means, let's just carry out a plan. So she was very much for optimism underpinning the war against climate change rather than despair. So I just wonder, I've thrown in sort of three sets of thoughts, but despair versus that notion of tragic optimism and doing your best in every set of circumstances.
Yeah. Historically, there have been so many moments when despair seemed to be so entirely justified. And I'm thinking of one in particular in American history, the tragic winter at Valley Forge, 1777-78, which was a real low point in the American War for Independence. A lot of those soldiers at Valley Forge, they froze to death, or they had limbs amputated because of frostbite. They had terrible disease. They didn't know where their next meal would come from, didn't know how they could ever possibly emerge victorious in this battle against the British Empire. But they didn't give up, and they didn't allow their despair, if you call it that, to run their lives. I think that's because they had latched on to a cause that they knew was right. And good people of solid character, when they find worthy causes, I think they should rejoice in that. They should realize maybe this is what I'm here for. I don't think any human was put on the earth to despair. I think we were put here to live to our fullest potential, to achieve great heights of achievement, to go places and use the talents and the characteristics that each of us have, improve on them, hone our skills, and leave the world a better place one way or the other, no matter what the circumstances may be along the way. To me, that's a very uplifting view of life right to start with. So if I were in a situation today that might seem to justify despair, I would think to myself, well, how would sitting here bemoaning my plight solve it in any way? How would it be an example for someone else? How could it benefit someone else if I just sit here and complain about my circumstances? It wouldn't. So at the very least, for the sake of others who might be observing, I want to show them that I am still in charge of my life, and I'm going to make the best of it, and I'm going to be an example to the best of my abilities so that others will say, wow, whether we ever met him or not, wow, just what we know of that person, that is an inspiration. Others will make life better because of your example. So that's yet another reason not to despair. And also a reason why I tell people, one of the things that I think is very healthy to do in your spare time is to find good biographies of great men and women who have been optimistic and of solid character and left the world a better place. That's a very motivational, inspirational thing to do, to read such great biographies, and I do it all the time.
In fact, what you throw to my mind there with that sense of purpose is, again, I'm quoting Professor G from Deakin. My favorite quote on what is optimism from our research is hers, which says, optimism is the evidence of dreams not yet realized.
Ah, yes, yes.
And so I think, you throw that to us, and you've just been so generous with your time today. Is there anything we haven't asked you that we should have asked you?
Oh, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I can think of something else I would like to add, and that is that if you need yet another reason to be optimistic, maybe you guys don't because you're in this business to encourage optimism, but for any of your viewers who might feel like they still don't have every reason they're looking for to be optimistic, well, think of it this way. We all have foes. We all have enemies, and we should, of course, work to have fewer of them, and we should not generate them by our own misbehavior. But if you can think of people who really a not very good character, and they oppose you because they are advocating something very different that you think is harmful. Well, take some delight in knowing that being a person who stands for what is right probably needles them more than anything else you could do. So every day I think to myself, well, I know those who argue for things like government control of our lives are probably very unhappy with me today. Well, that's perfectly all right. That makes me happier, knowing that I've done my job. So hopefully I can do it so much better that I can ultimately convince even them to come around. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so for us, one of the things we often say is optimism is a state of mind, not a state of the world. And people don't get that. You know, they confuse optimism with happiness. They confuse optimism with joy. But optimism is that belief. I don't know if you ever studied Mother Julian of Norwich, who lived through the Black Plague, but she wrote, "All shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well." And had she lived 700 years, she could have written the Harvard Medical School definition of optimism, which is a belief that good things will happen and that things will work out in the end. And I think, you know, that's one of the struggles of communication, because oftentimes, you know, being optimistic is used as a pejorative rather than a matter of praise. So that's where we irritate people sometimes by constantly advocating optimism, even in the most tragic of times. And, you know, I don't know what your views are on the Ukrainian war, but, you know, Zelensky was interviewed by Fareed Zakaria, and Zakaria said to him, "How do you stay so optimistic in the face of such evil?" And Zelensky, like you, said, "It's because I believe in people. My people and the people of the world." So any reflections on, you know, the battle, the Ukrainian battle, where clearly, you know, in fact, I saw a poll yesterday, 90% of the Ukrainians believe they're going to win.
Yeah.
And they will win because they believe they're going to win. So again, I think this war is almost, you know, the Putin and his pessimistic view of the world versus Zelensky and his people and their optimistic belief in liberty and freedom.
Yeah, any general who goes into battle, I think any good one, will tell you that he wants his troops to believe in success. He doesn't want them to go into the battle already having given up, already having decided what the future that hasn't happened yet is going to be, and that it's going to be a bad one. You don't win battles that way of any kind. I think you put it well when you said that this is all about the mind, not the world. You mentioned Viktor Frankl, who spent all that time in a concentration camp. I mean, what must the world have looked to him at that time as he was in that concentration camp? And if that was the only factor in deciding his mental state, he would have given up immediately, because it had to look awfully dark in those years and inside that camp. But he didn't. And all these years after his passing, we have people all over the world inspired by Man's Search for Meaning, his primary book. So he sure left the world a better place because he was in it. And I don't think he would have done that had he been a pessimist. He would have given up right from the start.
Well, look, thank you. Do you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I need to say that last note certainly leaves us with a wonderful and inspiring way of looking at the world, and to, as you say, to leave the world a better place and use our optimism, which is we see as our superpower, to you know, apply that and share it and use that as our influence and impact on the world. So thanks very much, Larry.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you. And final note, I want to say that I would guess that most pessimists, even, you know, if they were honest for a moment, would tell you that they'd rather sit in on a meeting of optimists than a meeting of fellow pessimists.
I think you're right.
They don't need any more of it.
Well, I'll tell you two of our interventions. One, in Australia, the typical greeting is "G'day, how are you?" And the typical response is "not bad" or "not too bad." So it's this wasted greeting and wasted answers. So our intervention that we've done in prison and hospitals is to get rid of the question, "How are you?" and replace it with, "What's been the best thing in your day?"
Oh, that's great.
And my funniest story is at the local supermarket. I first started advocating that when we were wearing masks. And this fellow looks at me post-mask and he says, "You're the guy that told me to change my greeting." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Oh, God, I don't have time to listen to all those good stories." It was the loveliest Australian backhander.
You have time for another quick story?
Of course, we have time for long stories.
Okay, well, you made me think of something that the founder of the foundation I'm associated with, the Foundation for Economic Education, I knew him in the last 7 years of his life before he died in 1983. His name was Leonard Reed, no relation. But he was known for saying a particular line when anyone complained about the weather. If he was maybe speaking at a service club and it was pouring down raining outside, or lightning, thundering, or a snowstorm, whatever, you have people who would come up and say, "Wow, what a bad day," or have you looked out the window? Oh, what a terrible day. He would immediately say, "No, it's a great day." And after a pause, he would say, "Every day is a great day." And then after a further pause, he would say, "That's my way of showing appreciation for the fact that at least when it comes to the weather, God and not the government is in charge." And then invariably people would say, "Oh, well, yeah, that's a good thought. Tell me, what do you do for a living?" And then he would have an opportunity to share his thoughts on things like the role of government and personal liberties and that kind of thing, all prompted by that remark about the weather.
We do. We also advocate talking to strangers. So on the
Yeah.
street, you smile and say hello to everyone. And if they respond, you can pause for a moment because it will start a conversation. I'm not wearing it now, but yesterday I delivered a speech. I had this beautiful silk tie, orange silk tie, and it came as a result of speaking to a stranger.
Ah,
And a year later, he took me to breakfast last week and brought this little box in which was a beautiful orange silk tie. He knew my colouring, but that was part of the bounty of speaking to strangers. But we love doing that too.
yeah, yeah. I wonder too if we're losing that among our young people. Maybe you don't see that in Australia. I don't know, but here I can't help but notice that kids in their, say, late teens, early 20s are not as quick to say hello and to smile or to engage you as older people are. And there have been many times when I've said hello, passing somebody in the street who might be 18, 19, 20, and I got no reaction whatever. And I always think to myself, I wish I had stopped them and said, "Hey, you're almost 20 now. I know you weren't supposed to talk to strangers when you were 3, but it's okay now at 20. And if all you do is just say hello back, you'll feel better for it, just as I will. So why not put forth that minimal effort to say hello and smile?"
The Dalai Lama says we've got to model optimism. So the other day I saw an adult woman, pulling her baby out of the car, and she never got off her phone.
Oh,
Right. So it's kid out, into the pram. Again, the next day I saw the opposite. I saw a mother with no mobile phone, just constantly talking to her child in the stroller. So
oh
you
my
see the good and the bad. I see both older people and younger people focused on their phone. And these days, many of them wear earbuds.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you say hello, they don't hear you.
Yeah, that's a
So
good
I
point.
make a point, particularly if I'm in a park or the like, where I just throw the hand up as well.
Yeah.
So that they're seeing I'm saying something to them. And you still get a response. So I reckon I get about 80% of people who respond to me saying hello or g'day, beautiful day,
Okay.
but almost no one initiates it.
Yeah.
So you've got to initiate. And the other 20%, I just take the view, who knows what's going on in their heads,
Yeah. Yeah.
or they just can't hear you.
Yeah. Yeah, I never hold it against them, except, I can't help but think that I hope that isn't typical. I hope that they are more readily the type of person who wants to make friends and speak, and maybe I just caught them at a bad moment. But
No, you're right. One of the universities has asked, well, in fact, last year we did a project for a university where they were feeling down, and we ended up doing a 2-day festival called Spring into Optimism. And everything was a sellout, from yoga for optimism at 6 a.m, you know, through to a town debate where we had the minister or secretary of development versus the mayor. And one side was the case for optimism, the other side was the case for even more optimism. But I've had another university approach me this year, and their view is that coming out of COVID, where particularly, you know, we live in Melbourne, we were locked down for 250 days in our homes or within, you know, walking within 5 kilometres of home, that a lot of 18-year-olds do not know how to meet strangers. So they're really good on TikTok, they're really good on Snapchat, they're really good on Instagram in meeting people. But as you say, they're not used to a stranger saying hello.
You know,
and that day on a train, there was a kid, maybe 15, who was obviously wagging school, or being truant from school, and he had his skateboard with him. And yeah, he looked a bit rough and tough. And I started talking to him. And in the course of the 15 minutes we were on the train together, we talked about his dreams, his aspirations, how he could connect school to what his aspirations were. No one had ever talked to him about connecting school to his ultimate dream, not his teachers, not his parents. And so for me, I got off that train hoping that I'd made a real difference in the life of one teenager. And I think you do that. And I know Jeff, you know, has been president of a soccer club. So he, not only does he coach them, but he you know, guides them in life. I think, you know, it's one of the purposes I think the three of us share.
Oh, yeah, it's such a great feeling, isn't it? When you can walk away thinking, I think I've made a positive difference in that person's life. I remember one of the moving moments of my first visit to Poland when it was under communist rule. It was in November of 1986. And my escorts, who were taking me to meet with people who were active in the underground, hoping to stay a step ahead of the government all along the way, one evening they said, we have a very special couple we want you to meet, Zbigniew and Sofia Romaszewski. I never had heard their names. I didn't know anything about them, but as it was explained to me, they had run underground radio, preaching a message of freedom for Poland in the first 6 months of martial law, which was declared by the communist regime back in December of '81, until they were arrested in the middle of '82 and given prison sentences. He was given 4 years in prison. She was given 3. Neither one had been out of prison very long when I was meeting with them in 1986. And here they were active again in the underground, not in radio, but in other ways. And I spent that evening asking them so many questions and finding that they were incredibly optimistic. I mean, I said things like, how do you know if you can win? I mean, you're up against the Army, Navy, and the Air Force of the evil empire, the Soviet Union. And, you know, I mean, that's pretty daunting odds, and it didn't matter to them because freedom for their beloved Poland meant everything to them. And at one point I said, well, when you were broadcasting on that illegal radio, how did you know if people were listening? And Sophia answered, and by the way, she's still living. She answered this way. She said, well, we wondered that as well. We could only broadcast for 8 or 10 minutes at a time. And then we had to tear the radio down, take it someplace else. Hopefully we wouldn't be traced. They ultimately were, but they did this for 6 months, set the radio up at the new place and broadcast for a few minutes again. But she said, one evening, we asked people on the air, if you are listening to this broadcast and if you believe in freedom for Poland, please go to your windows and blink your lights and call your friends who may be of the same view and ask them to do the same. And she then said in a very matter-of-fact way, we then went to the window and for hours, all of Warsaw was blinking. Well, you know, that was a terrible time for those people to go through, but they remained optimistic that freedom would prevail. And they didn't know, but less than 3 years later, they were free.
Yeah.
And they couldn't have known how many people, just me alone, have told that story to, that found some inspiration in what they told me. So you just never know. They told me a story that I know has inspired people in all the countries where I have shared that in the years since.
Thanks,
So
and I think one of our colleagues always talks about Kay Clancy talks about making ripples, and I think that's really what we've been talking about here, is making optimistic ripples in life, and hopefully they flow on and maybe move other people towards optimism. So I think that's certainly a sentiment I think captures the moment quite well.
And
Keep it up.
Kay shares a song, Wednesdays and Saturdays, Music for Optimism. And I think, going back to your philosophy for liberty, wasn't that something you advocated? More singing, more dancing, more love.
Absolutely. Yeah. Think of those Baltic states and the singing revolution that brought freedom to Estonia in particular, but so powerfully as well to Lithuania and Latvia. Yeah, singing lifts the heart. It is optimistic almost by its very nature.
My cousins, a number of cousins, in fact, one of my cousins leads an Australian Latvian choir, and they're off to the Latvian Song Festival in July. But I went to the first one after liberation from the Soviet Union. And there were about 15,000 dancers and about 120,000 people in the stadium and 10,000 singers. And when they sang the national anthem for the first time there, just, it brought me to tears, but just watching people, it was magnificent. And I think that film you referred to, The Singing Revolution, which is an Estonian film, but captures that philosophy of Latvia and Lithuania as well, where music was your way of fighting the dictatorship.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there were notable dissidents who were very involved in doing that, not only in the Baltic states, but think of Shostakovich in the Soviet Union. He composed music specifically as a way to object to the tyranny of Stalin. And Stalin was too dumb to realize what he was up to, but he did inspire many people, still does today. Okay, well, this has been very great, and I enjoyed it very much, and thank you for having me, and wish you all the best. Hope to see you in person on some future trip to Australia.